now. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our author talk for the Elisabeth Kübler-Ross Foundation. This morning we have Jennifer O'Brien, the author of The Hospice Doctor's Widow. And we also have this morning Ken Ross, who is a special guest star this morning, who just popped in. And normally what I'll do is spend a minute just introducing the foundation. But since Ken is here, I asked him if he would introduce the foundation. And then I'll just do a brief introduction of Jennifer, and she is going to give a wonderful talk this morning. And there'll be time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. If you have a question and you're not feeling particularly brave, you're welcome to put it up in the chat, and I'll be monitoring those questions. But at the end, there'll be an opportunity for people to use the fantastic Zoom hand raising emoji, and then I'll be able to track the order in which you're raising your hand. So welcome to all of you. If anybody would like to put up in the chat where it is that they're zooming in from, that's always interesting to see. We often have people from all over the United States, Canada, and sometimes from other countries. So thank you all. And Ken, would you mind just giving an introduction to the foundation that you single-handedly run? Thanks.
Sure. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you to Susan, of course, for running this beautiful program. And thank you to the wonderful Jennifer for joining us today. She's one of my favorite voices in this space. I ended up taking care of my mom for the last 9 years of her life here in Arizona. And a few days after she died, a woman showed up from Mumbai. She'd just flown over from India without even calling or arranging anything. And she said she had come to find inspiration for my mother. And so I ended up taking her to my mom's bedroom where she died and having her sit in the bed and talk to her for a number of hours and just telling her stories. And she said she felt enough inspiration just from her energy that she was going to go back to India and start a hospice in honor of Elisabeth. And I thought, wow, like even though I thought my mother was gone, her legacy was still here. And so I ended up starting a foundation 19 years ago. And now we have chapters in 12 different countries. We have programming in almost 20 countries. We do advocacy. We do my mom's archives. We've donated them to Stanford. And we do lots of programs, including anything in hospice, grief support, and palliative care to continue the mission that my mom started back in the 60s. She didn't have time to go to all these countries, but we're continuing her mission and very proud of some of our incredible programs going on in Southeast Asia, Latin America, and we're going to be working on Africa next year. So anyway, I'll turn it back over to Susan and Jennifer, and I hope and I know you'll enjoy this morning. So thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks so much, Ken. This is reminding me that we should have you back on just for a conversation about your mom's life, her work, and what's happening with the foundation. It's been a little while since we've done that. So thank you all. I just want to preface by this introduction by saying that I am in a 100-and-something-year-old retreat house in Mill Valley, California, in the middle of a redwood forest, which is wonderful for lots of things. But Jennifer has told me a number of times in our pre-session chat that I was freezing up. So Jennifer is the co-host. Should I fall out of the room or freeze or any of those things, Jennifer will continue running this talk. And just thank you all for being here. Technology is wonderful almost all of the time until it's not. Jennifer, I first became aware of your work, I think it was maybe 3 years ago, through a number of friends who also have podcasts and work in this end-of-life space around educating people. And I was really fascinated by your book, by the title, The Hospice Doctor's Widow. I think for many of us that have worked in hospice for decades, you know, the thought of our hospice doctor dying, like that was like, oh my God, what could we do? But then to be the spouse of that person who spent a lifetime, really a lifetime dedicated to making sure that other people have a death that's as aligned to who they are as a person, that's integral to their humanity. You know, I think for most people understand that to be really a calling, not so much a job that they're going to do. And I just am so grateful that you have time to talk with us this morning. I know The other thing that I was so interested in is that one of the resources, or the resource that really sustained you in your grieving process, was a creative one. And being on a writing retreat, especially, I thought this would be a wonderful author talk for us to have this morning. So I would like for you to introduce yourself more fully, but why don't you go ahead and take the reins?
I will do it. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because my own introduction is part of that. So let me just hold on here. Move this guy over here. Present. Okay. Sorry. As a co-host, people are entering and I'm admitting them. All right, so thanks so much, and we'll go ahead and get started. As I'm going to begin with a little bit about me because I think it's important just to the whole story and to the book. The lower left there is a picture of me and my only sibling, David O'Brien. David was 5 years younger than I, and he died following a motor vehicle accident. He was in a coma for 3 weeks after the accident. He was 13 at the time. I was 18. And just after no imaging revealed that there was no more brain activity, my parents had to make the decision to extubate him, and he died 41 years ago this month. Up top is me and my mom, not quite 20 years after David died, was diagnosed with a pancreatic cancer. She lived for 5.5 weeks following the diagnosis. I was her primary family caregiver. I was lucky enough to be able to be with her the entire time. And so she died, like I said, not quite 20 years after my brother died. And then most recently, there in the lower right is me and my dad. My father died 2 summers ago, and he had long suffered from heart disease, congestive heart failure, some really bad lung disease, and ultimately had a fell and suffered a hip fracture and declined the surgery and died a very peaceful death. I was long distance caregiver to my father, which was really just the best way to do that. He and I had a difficult relationship. For quite a while, we were out of communication, so that when we came back into communication and I was able to guide him and care for him and speak with his doctors and so forth, long distance, it was still very much a caregiver relationship, but it was a long distance one, and it was one that somewhat, influenced by the fact that we had had a difficult time in our relationship, which happens, right, in caregiving. So that's that. On the professional side of things, I have been in healthcare for 36 plus years. I like to say I started when I was 12, but that's not true. 36 plus years strictly on the administrative, business, leadership side of healthcare, nothing clinical. From my standpoint, I educated physicians and their staffs on practice management. I have my master's degree in organization development, which is basically how organizations and companies undergo change. And probably in the last almost 20 years, I have done this interim leadership for sometimes within academic medical departments, and especially with large private practices, coming in on an interim basis and CEOing for them for what is usually 2 to 4 years. I typically don't get asked to come in and help when things are grand. It's usually when things have gone sideways in a number of terrible ways, and they need some help. I'm a change agent. I'm never gonna do it long term. I'm just gonna get in there, try to fix some things, hire my replacement, and move on. And so in, let's see, about 2009, I came down from Chicago to Little Rock, Arkansas, to do one of those interim CEOing positions for a very large orthopedic surgery practice. And I was kind of commuting between Little Rock and Chicago. I certainly had no intention of staying in Little Rock. I had been at the job for a couple of years, and the end was in sight when I met this adorable fellow that you see in the lower left. His name was Bob Lemberg. We fell crazy in love. Hospice was a very important part of Bob's career, but it was not his entire career. He had been a plastic and reconstructive surgeon for a little over 30 years when a neck injury meant that he could not operate without excruciating pain. And so he couldn't operate anymore, and yet he was nowhere near finished being a physician, and he was really compelled by hospice, and he did what would have been called back in the day a preceptorship, and managed to get himself boarded in a hospice and palliative care through the American College of Surgeons. And when I met him, he had already been doing that for a few years. I think one of the things that drew me to Bob was the work that he was doing with families, and it was because I had lost my brother, and I had lost my mother, and I knew how important the work he was doing was. So we fell crazy in love. We got married. We were living the dream. Bob was on faculty at our med center here in Little Rock, Arkansas, and he found a couple of lumps on the left side of his neck. I did finish up the orthopedic surgery job, by the way, before this happened, but found a couple of lumps on the left side of his neck. After some diagnostics, it was determined that these were metastatic sites. There were many metastatic sites from a renal clear cell carcinoma in his left side. And so we were faced with that, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. The other thing about me that you need to know is that I am a self-taught collage artist. I have done analog collage, but what you see on the screen here are a bunch of my different digital collages that I have done, some related to healthcare and loss, and some not. And so when Bob got sick, and I was his only caregiver, neither of us had kids, and we were here in Little Rock away from extended family. When he got sick, I started art journaling. I started doing some of these collages to process my own thoughts and feelings. It was sort of a form of self-care. In some cases, to document his wisdom, because I knew we were now having to apply his experience and wisdom to ourselves. And I kept this art journal while he was sick. If you're wondering what an art journal is, it's kind of like a regular journal, except there's art. These are some pages from the journal. It's art, and then I make the notes on top of the collages. So I kept going with the journal for about a year and a half after Bob died, at which point I was doing another interim CEO position, this time for a large multi-specialty medical practice here in Little Rock. And I had a wonderful relationship with one of the neurologists, and he was lamenting to me one day that he was in the process of diagnosing 3 different patients with ALS. By this time, I had my digital collage art journal printed using a vacation, those vacation book that that you can drop all your vacation photos in and you get a book in the mail that says this is what Tahiti was like. Well, I used one of those to create a physical journal. And I brought it to Dr. Silzer, and he took it home and came back the next day and he said, yeah, Jen, you're not getting your journal back. I will be loaning it to these 3 patients and especially their spouses. And you need to figure out how to get that thing published, because it would really help a lot of people, a lot of family caregivers who are in the situation that you went through. And so I did. I was really compelled by this, and I found a small press, and they took a chance on it, and it was published in 2020, February of 2020, as The Hospice Doctor's Widow. And I'm pleased to say it's an unlikely book, as you'll see. We're gonna delve into it here in a little bit. But it won a bunch of awards that I'm extremely proud of. Perhaps what I am more proud of, though, is that he was right, Dr. Silzer. It has helped a lot of people at this point. It has really helped a lot of people. I hear from them sometimes, and so this book has been out for 4.5 years. I thought today that we would start with the art. And so this is a digital collage that you see on the screen. This is it as it was completed. The theme of it was condolence notes. I wrote a piece on writing condolence notes, and I created this to go with it. But I want to show you how I do that, so that as I'm reading to you from the pages in the book, you can have an idea of what goes into most of those collages. So this is the completed one. This is the first layer. One of the things I love about digital collage is it's all about layering. And life is all about layering. So this is an actual love letter, and I scanned it into my computer. It's old, it's from 1951, and it was written on that sort of onion skin paper, which is why you can see the writing on both sides have come through on the scan. I almost always add texture and rough edges, because life has a lot of texture and rough edges. So I added that around the corners. This is now a layer of a color I love that I refer to as spun sugar. It's sort of layering that color over those other layers, adding this text, this thematic text, and the graphic of the letter, you know, the envelope and the paper. Again, some more sort of postal themed little doodads. And then finally, the flowers on the side and the top, and the hand with the quill to start. And we're back to the completed collage. So I just thought that would help you to understand a little bit more as we dig into this book. Precious time. He has helped families understand by telling them they were into precious time, meaning death is likely, if not imminent. Precious time is when you say what you need to say and you don't say what you will later regret. Now it is us. We are into precious time. He is going to die of this disease, and I will go on and have to live with how I handled our precious time. So this was a term Bob coined, and he said it just like that, with the emphasis on the word precious. Bob used to say, I've seen death many times. The patient is going to be fine. It's the family I worry about. And this was his way of saying to the family, this isn't going on forever. There's not much time left. And so you need to make the most of this precious time. And it's a term that has really been useful. I have, since the publication of the book and since working in this space, I have implemented what I call the triad of certainty. At the end of life comes death. There are no do-overs in end of life, and changed forever, loved ones remain and remember. And so that notion of precious time that Bob introduced, that fact that it's really the family, the loved ones rather, that go on, and they're the ones we sort of worry about, that I think made precious time almost larger than the book, The Hospice Doctor's Widow, as more and more professionals in the death space learned of the term and the use of the term precious time. And then more healthcare professionals, Barbara Carnes wrote a blog post about it. I did a guest blog post in The Good Death about precious time. And I finally created this free download. If you are in the healthcare space or in the death care space, and dealing with families before their loved ones die, this is not a bad download. You can, of course, point your little phone at the QR code and download it. It has some case studies in it, and it tells you a bit about how useful that term is and why. Precious time is when we say our I love yous and our I'm sorries and our goodbyes. And I think Bob and I both felt like worse than losing someone you love would be to lose someone you love of an illness and having lost them thinking, I thought we had more time. So anyway, I encourage you to download that. He helps patients understand the personalization of end-of-life choices by telling them about his own parents. My dad wanted only to be kept comfortable. My mother wanted every last life-extending measure. We honored both of their wishes because the right choice for a person is their own. This is true. Bob's parents both lived into their 90s. And this is an absolute true story. And he did tell it frequently with families to help them understand that the right answer is their answer in terms of what they wanted at the end of their life. And it turns out, based on this Pew survey, that Bob's parents were not unlike the rest of us, at least here in the US. This survey, as you can see, is if people had a disease with no hope of improvement, and then it gives you how many of that, what percentage of them would want treatment stopped so that they could be kept comfortable and die, and what percentage of them wanted us to do everything we possibly can to extend their life. And then, of course, the 3 different scenarios. And as you can see, they are very evenly split. And as you get into difficult day-to-day functions, it's evenly split. So what's important, I think, to take away from the story of Bob's parents and from this data, is that indeed, we may want different things. And this is not, this is not specific to socioeconomic strata, to faith or religion, to culture, to race. This split happens across the board within families, right? And that's why this is so important to have these conversations with the people you love, because they might be opposite of you. They might be a lot like you in a lot of ways, but opposite of how you feel and what you want at the end of your life. So turns out we have some data to work with there. As a physician working at a world-renowned treatment center, he cares for patients and families from all over the world. Sometimes patients are too sick to make the trip home and have to die in our town. That always breaks his heart. He's glad to be part of a center of excellence, but several times a year he comes home from work saddened I just can't get this patient home to die, he says. He understands the desire to travel for the best care, but he's always troubled when people push it a little too long or have a complication and have to be away from their community when they die. I think the hard time Bob had with this was perhaps more for the family caregiver who had come with the patient for the treatment, because there was almost always a family caregiver who was, having to suffer the death of their loved one, not be in their community. I think this is an important thing for all of us to consider, because so often now, when faced with a difficult diagnosis, we go to the internet, go to the Google, and we might find a study or a different country that has an alternative treatment or all kinds of things. And the typical reaction to this sort of research and these sorts of results is, what do I have to lose? I might as well go. And people say that as though it's a statement, but I submit to you that it is indeed a question. And what they have to lose is exactly what used to sadden Bob so much, is dying away from their community and leaving their caregiver in the position of having to experience that far away from home. So just something to consider. One of the things, as I said earlier, I wanted to include in this journal as Bob was dying was not just what I was going through and what we were going through, but also, like I said, some of his wisdom and experience. He said to his cousin, "I'm planning my memorial service." She interrupted, "Oh, you're not going to need one of those." I'm not kidding about this. I could hear her through the phone. He died 3 weeks later. And I just think that's like a classic trying to say something and it kind of being the wrong thing. Because let's face it, we're all going to need one of those, or at least the plan not to have one of those. We had the foresight to transfer the cars and other property to my name. When the notary public made a comment about why we were doing it, we told her Bob was dying. She squirmed uncomfortably. I said, "We're at peace with it," something I had heard Bob say to others. For the most part, it's true. At the end of life, people die. I wish more people would accept that openly. We are not at war with it. We are at peace with the fact that at the end of life comes death. We are facing the tasks of getting things in order so that when the time comes, I will only have to love him, mourn his death, and miss him. We did this and a lot of other, this is another page, don't worry, I'm not reading this one to you. We did a lot of preparations. As you can imagine, long before Bob got sick, we spoke about death at the dinner table fairly openly. And we had lots of things in place, advanced directives and all those sorts of things. When he got sick, it was very helpful to have started all of that stuff in, at a time when it was in the abstract. But these are some of the things we did after he got sick. And then, of course, at the bottom, a couple of the things we didn't do, we failed to do. But we did a lot. He knew that I was not going to do well in the 3,000 square foot, 100-year-old house, huge house that we lived in that had a garden and 2 water features, which, give me a break, that was never going to work for me by myself. He knew this, and so we put it on the market and we moved into this beautiful condo that I live in now. He did all sorts of preparation. We went up to the VA HR office about a month before he died, and we did all of the paperwork for my VA survivor benefits. We just did about everything. Like I say at the bottom, we failed to put the utilities in my name, which I got to tell you, is a bummer. It was a bummer because if you've ever dealt with a utility following the death of a loved one, it's painful. They say things like, we need to talk to the account holder. I just told you he's dead. If you get in touch with the account holder, please have him contact me. And I thought I had all the passwords, you know, I thought I had all the formulas for the passwords, and grief brain is real. And so he died, and my brain went fuzzy on the password thing. And so that became a bigger problem than it should have been. But he was very specific on a lot of things, and all of it was a huge, huge gift to me. After I got into this space and published the book and started talking about how important it is to do this kind of preparation, ideally before anybody gets sick, but certainly after they do, people kept saying to me, how do I do that? What, you know, where's the checklist? And so I created this At Peace toolkit that was sort of spun off from that day that we talked to the notary public. The title of it is, anyway, here again is a free download, and you're welcome to download it and take a look at it. As you can see, I like to provide resources to anybody and everybody who's interested in them. You will have to put your email in order to get any of these resources. If you don't want to hear from me after you do that, just go back in and unsubscribe. It's fine. It's not going to bother me at all. But I do send out a monthly-ish newsletter, and you may get one of those after if you download one of these resources. If I don't get out of this house soon, he's not going to live to die of cancer, and I will do life without parole. Here's the thing. Caregiving is not always this like dreamy Florence Nightingale scene. Sometimes you want to murder the person you're caring for. And I certainly felt that on more than one occasion with my husband. I don't know that I ever got into that with my mom and my dad when I was caring for them, but I certainly had moments with my husband where I thought we might not make it. And one of those was a big argument that we had about 4 weeks after he was diagnosed. We were supposed to go up to Northwest Arkansas for the weekend to see a beautiful art museum up there. And we were getting ready to go, and I was eager to get on the road, and he was tired. It was a Saturday morning, and he got angry with me, and he said, "Jen, I am going to get you some literature on cancer fatigue." And to which I proudly, not so proudly, responded, "Bob, I'm not one of your bleeping palliative care fellows." Needless to say, it didn't go well, and we sort of went to our corners and licked our wounds. And when I was in mine, I was chiding myself for how I had possibly engaged in a silly argument with this man I loved so much, who I had just learned I was not going to have much more time with. But I had been eager to make some memories. And that's when I had this sort of epiphany. And I'm so glad I had it early on. We were going through 2 different processes. He was dying and I was surviving. And I will tell you that we did not have any silly arguments after that. Anticipatory grief, grieving before your loved one actually dies. It's real. It can be huge. In one study, 40% of widows reported anticipatory grief as worse than the grief after the death. I am suffering from anticipatory grief. The key is honoring my anticipatory grief while not allowing it to spoil the time we have left together. And this sentiment, hope for the best and prepare for the worst. Or if you're a Sammy Winemaker follower, it's hope for the best and prepare for the rest, which I actually kind of like better. But this I learned in my career when I was doing an interim role in a cancer department, in a hematology oncology department, with a world-renowned lung cancer specialist who used to say this to patients at every clinic visit. We hope for the best and we prepare for the worst. He would say this every single visit. And I think this was really valuable in his care for patients and their families. The repetition meant that it was a touchstone. They could expect to hear it at every visit. They knew it was part of the care. And it allowed him to, touch base. I see that you're, feeling really good on the hope side of things. How are things going on the preparation side? And therefore he could bring patients and their families along. The other thing I think is so important about this is the and. It's an and. Preparation for end of life is not a hope killer. We do both. We can do both. We are complex beings and we are perfectly capable of doing both. The best changes over time. At first, when Bob first got the diagnosis, I think it was about 2 weeks after the initial biopsy, they'd sent the specimen to a special lab in Houston in hopes of finding that there was a genetic makeup to the cancer that corresponded with one of the newer targeted therapies that would in fact cure him. And so for those first couple of weeks, the best was a cure. And then when that was not going to happen, the best was more time. And then at a certain point, time alone was not really the best. It needed to be time without suffering, quality time. So anyway, the takeaway here is both, and it's always both. Yesterday, we cried together about how much we will miss each other when he dies. We are becoming closer and closer, and it feels so good. I must have faith. What other choice do I have? I can't pull away. The regret after he dies will be unbearable. I want to know that I loved him thoroughly. That's my goal from now until he's gone. And when he's gone, I'll be alone. I will not miss the sleepless nights filled with his relentless moaning, wheezing, and suffering. I will not miss trying yet failing to comfort him. I will not miss wrapping his swollen legs. I will not miss giving him injections. I will not miss changing the sheets in the middle of the night because of his night sweats. I will miss loving someone so much that I do all of these things. This really is the crux of the family caregiver situation. You are working harder. You are doing things you never thought you could do, all in the name of love. And you know that at the end of it, your person will die. And it's a very, very difficult combination to manage. It's a big job. It's a huge, huge job. So as I said, I've been a serial CEO, been on the leadership side of healthcare for a long time. I've hired for a lot of different jobs. And I found myself a couple of years ago thinking, I wonder what it would take to hire for the position of family caregiver. When you're hiring, of course, the first thing you start with is a position description. So I created a position description for the position of family caregiver, uncompensated caregiver. Again, here, a free download. You are welcome to download it if you wish. This is what it's like. This is not meant up here for you to read it. I'm hoping you'll download it and take a look at it later. The reason this is up on the screen is for you to see just how big a job this is. I have had more than one healthcare professional, hospice professional for that matter, read this and say, well, this isn't true. We don't call on family caregivers to do this or that. And it is all true. It is all true. I created it myself. I vetted it through a physician who is family caregiver to her adult quadriplegic son. I vetted it through a couple of other people on both the family caregiver side and the professional caregiver side. And it's very thorough and it's very true. So take a look at it. If you are doing family caregiving right now, it will validate your work and your sense of how big that job really is. If you are doing professional caregiving at this point, it will give you some real insight as to what your patient's family caregiver is going through and being called upon to do. And the average duration of family caregiving, according to the National Alliance for Caregiving and the AARP, is 4.5 years. That's the average. So lots of folks, my mom was sick for 5.5 weeks. That means if 4.5 years is the average, that means lots of people are caregiving for 10, perhaps 20 years. It's a very, very long time to be doing the very big job. And of course, the job may not start out as big as that position description that you just looked at on the screen. It usually creeps in, right? It starts with you going by and helping to pay the bills, perhaps, and then eventually it grows bigger, especially if we're talking about our elderly loved ones and their progression. But 4.5 years is a long time. Sorry, I want to just make a point. During this caregiving, you are mostly living day to day. You are living laboratory result to laboratory result, image to image. Sometimes you are going blood sugar to blood sugar in an hour or two, pulse ox. You are doing everything you can to sustain a meaningful life for this person you love who has a life-limiting or serious condition. That's a long time. There are two big changes that the family caregiver goes through that I think are worth paying attention to. The first one is when they go from being life-sustaining family caregiver to end-of-life or hospice family caregiver. If we were using business language, we would say this is a paradigm shift of extraordinary proportions. And we would agree that the perhaps as long as 2 or 3 hour admission visit by the hospice nurse does almost nothing toward training me as what has been a life-sustaining caregiver, again, sometimes for decades, to becoming an end-of-life or hospice family caregiver. I have talked with a number of hospices about what we can do to provide resources to family caregivers so that they can make that transition more smoothly, that whether or not someone is eating and whether or not they are sleeping for 22 out of the 24 hours a day, these things are totally different in end-of-life family caregiving than they were in life-sustaining family caregiver giving. And then the second big change that the family caregiver goes through is when their person dies and they transition to becoming a griever. I'm not going to read this to you. I'm just going to kind of tell you the story. Bob did not admit himself to hospice status until probably about 10 days before he died. I am happy to answer questions about this. Believe me, I have given it a lot of thought over time because Bob was a big believer in hospice, and yet, speaking as objectively as I am capable of speaking on this topic, We waited too long. He waited too long. And he was in charge, he was the doctor, and it was very important. That was the biggest part of his identity. And I was not going to do anything to take that away from him in the last years, months, and days before he died. So he was in charge, right? We had a sort of a DIY palliative care situation, and DIY palliative care is just not that doable, just so you know. Anyway, we'd had a number of really terrible, terrible nights. And after one of them, I commented to him, wow, that was really rough last night, high fever, just really, really rough night. And he got cross with me and said, Jen, I'm dying. What's the worst that happens? I die. And I said, Bob, that's actually not the worst that happens. I said, if I walk back into the bedroom and you've died, I know what to do. I know who to call. But you have told me over and over again, even when he was healthy, by the way, he told me over and over again, don't call the EMTs until I'm cold and blue. If anything happens to me, don't call the EMTs until I'm cold and blue. And so what happens if you don't die? What happens if you seize? I said to him, or what happens if you fall and you have a head bleed? And what am I supposed to do then? You've told me not to call the EMTs. I live in the South. It'll only be a matter of time before the sheriff shows up and says, lady, you killed your husband by not calling 911. And he realized I was right. His eyes kind of widened at that point, and he called and admitted himself later that day to hospice status at home. So if it's hard for the hospice doctor to admit himself to hospice status, then it is hard for everyone. We have not figured this out in our healthcare system. And I'm happy to talk more about that if anybody wants to, but I'm going to press on for right now because I have some big news. The Hospice Doctor's Widow, if you have the book or have seen the book, and you've seen these front covers as I've been showing the slides, you know that the front cover I've been showing you all today is very different from the front cover on your copy of the book. That is because this is the front cover of the second edition of the Hospice Doctor's Widow. It will also be a hardback. It will be 96 pages, whereas the other one, the first edition, was 85, which means it has 9 additional art journal entries. And I am absolutely thrilled to tell you that it has a foreword written by Elisabeth Kübler-Ross. And it will be out later this year. So, so that's exciting. And you all are the first who will see a preview of a couple of the new journal entries. And here's one of them: laughing and learning, grieving and healing, joyful and longing, weary and determined, eager and content. It's not or, it's not but, it's and. It's almost always and. Remember when we talked about hope for the best and prepare for the worst, and we talked about the and. I would submit to you, perhaps even challenge you, to every time you are considering writing or saying the word but or the word or, that it might be more accurate. In my estimation, it will be more accurate to replace those words with and. We tend to have this binary approach. If a person is grieving the death of a loved one, they certainly shouldn't be laughing. Yeah, no, you do both. You can do both. Again, we're complex beings, and it's almost always an and. Any form that asks me for emergency contact and grocery shopping still set off some degree of grief and loss just about every time, even years later. So in other words, the places one goes for help, care, or nourishment are risky for me. I am not alone in this. Other widows describe feeling the same way. The blossom must die for the fruit to grow. I read this somewhere, probably on the internet. It's trite and it's true, but I want both. I want the blossom and the fruit. One of the things I love about art journaling is when you have a reaction to something like that and you feel like you want both the blossom and the fruit, you create art where the blossom continues to live when the fruit, even when the fruit comes. And that's what I did here. The other big news I have for you is that I have a second book that will also be out later this year. It's a paperback. It's smaller book in size, but it's 170 pages. I told you that I was a serial CEO and that I have been a serial family caregiver. And one of the things that became very clear to me, especially after this book came out, and I spent a lot of time learning more about family caregiving from a more objective perspective and just pondering and being in the space with other family caregivers, is that the family caregiver position is a leadership position. And I say that it is not only a leadership position, it is a leadership position that is far more important than the CEO of any Fortune 500 company, because it's your person, it's the person you love, and you're taking care of them. And there is simply nothing more important than that. There is no greater mission or vision. And so it occurred to me that a lot of family caregivers don't have experience in leadership like I do. And so I decided to write a book empowering family caregivers with leadership strategies and leadership concepts and resources and so forth. So I'm really pleased with this book. I wish I could give you all an exact date on both of these books. I can't. I'm in a small publishing world, and we are focusing a little bit more on the quality of this product necessarily than rushing it along, but it should be very soon. So keep in touch and I will let you know. This is the last page of the second edition of the Hospice Doctor's Widow. Love is greater than death. I will tell you, death is greater than lots of things. Death is greater than the best doctor. Death is greater than a healthy lifestyle. Death is greater than remission. Death is even greater than a cure. But love is greater than death. And that is it. I'm going to stop the share. That's my website, or hospicedoctorswidow.com. And please be in touch. Let's see.
Thank you, Jennifer, so much. There's so many things that, at first I started, like, I kind of take some notes, and I was like, oh, this idea that, a corporate, like a CEO type, and then working with art and caregiving. And as I was listening to you talk, I just thought that makes so much sense, that somebody that would have the skill set of a CEO, which is kind of what you're doing. If you're caregiving for somebody, you have to be able to really listen to what somebody else is saying, even if their point of view is so different than your own. And you may be having to do that with multiple people whose point of view is very different from your own, and really being able to think about, what they're saying and what they mean, and try to synthesize that in some way where everybody feels like they're getting something. This idea of like scheduling, just being able to schedule around caregiving is a whole skill set in itself. So it makes so much sense. And I'm so grateful that I'm really interested in in the second book too, The Care Boss. We'll have to have you back on to talk about that when that comes out. Um, one of the things that really struck me was when you had the slide up about he is dying and I'm surviving. And that conversation that as somebody, you just brought back change. I had a friend of mine, 3 friends of mine were in a caregiving support, were in a life-threatened group during the AIDS epidemic. And one of them had cancer and the other 2 had AIDS. And it was clear that all 3 of them were going to die. And during the time I was attending a support group for caregivers that met at the same time. So we could bring our loved ones, drop them at the caregiving group, and then we could go to our group. And we met upstairs and they were downstairs. And I remember coming out one day and we were very tearful. All of the caregiver group was just like, and one of my friends came out and he's like, oh, here they are, the boohoo group. And I'm like, what are you talking about? He goes, I don't know. We're just sitting there trying to like live our lives. And you all are up there just bawling your eyes out all the time. The idea that the caregiver is carrying the weight of making sure that person is as safe and cared for as possible. And they're just like, I just want to stay alive today. That's all I'm thinking about. And the caregiver is thinking about, oh my God, I have to do all of these things, plus make sure they stay alive. And, that tension is just so incredibly hard to navigate without wanting to slap somebody else on the head sometimes.
Right, for
Yeah,
sure.
that also happened with my loved one, one of my that was dying. We would have the fight in the hospital where I just like storm out and I'm never going to see you again. And then like 5 hours later, he'd call and be like, are we done fighting now? And I'd be like, yeah, I guess we're done now. I'll come back to the hospital. But I think that there's so few people that really talk about that is part of caregiving for somebody that you love. It's hard to, I think sometimes there's a picture painted of, we're going to be really tired, but it's going to be all loving and like, great and really hard, but we're not, we're, that person, like whatever they say or do, like we have to do that because they're the person dying. And I think the reality is they may be a person dying, but they're also a person that we love and sometimes have conflict with and still love on the other side of that conflict. So I really appreciate you
Well,
talking.
absolutely. But I think, and one of the things I talk about, especially in the second book, is there's a big section on self-management.
Mhm.
And there's the fact that you are also managing your future self, the self that will live on after the death of this person. And that is just such a tough thing. I became a much nicer person than I really am when Bob was sick because, and kind of a more subservient person. I was not willing to look back one day and think, why did I have that stupid argument with that man that I loved so much? And I knew I had limited time with him. So, it wasn't easy, but it was totally worth it.
Yes.
Sort of a proactive regret management kind of situation.
Well, and I also really appreciate that idea of like what your future self is going to be navigating. This was a conversation my father, when he was dying, refused to let anybody do his personal care. So he was stumbling across this bedroom and he would grab the swinging, like very fake swinging glass door of his shower and swing himself over to the toilet. And over time, I finally just said one day, that is no longer happening. And he said, this is my dad. And I said, what if you like it breaks and you die like cut up to death? He goes, well, if that's the way I'm going to die, then that's just the way I'm going to die. You just have to deal with it. I said, like, no, absolutely not, because the person that's going to find you in there is my mother, your wife, who will
Right.
never be able to survive that. So this is the cutoff point of where you get everything you want when you're dying. You're
Right.
not going to get that one.
Right. I
And
tell people death is not the enemy.
yes,
Trauma is the enemy. Suffering is
100%.
the enemy. And that's exactly right. We had a similar situation with the shower.
Yeah.
He wasn't using the door, but same sort of thing where I was like, oh my gosh, we're both going to die here. And
Yes.
it was awful. So yeah, you're doing everything you can to avoid those, make it so you don't have that there won't be trauma, that there won't be suffering.
Because there's already going to be plenty of grief, just the everyday grief of living without your loved one. That is plenty to navigate after their death.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm really curious too about your art, has that always been part of your processing of information, or is this something that really sort of kind of blossomed during this experience of you navigating this with your husband?
It's been a part of my processing for a really long time. Definitely was a part. It started with a camera that and an ex-husband where I got his camera, he wasn't using it, so what the heck. And I used to take some black and white photos. I'm kind of embarrassed to admit this with Ken on the call, but I will anyway. But anyway, I did some decent photographs, and then after my mom died, I took her ashes out I grew up in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and my brother is buried in a town north of there called Tulpa. And I took my mother's ashes out to my brother's grave to scatter them. And I ended up spending some time in Santa Fe by myself. And I went to an art journaling workshop, and I didn't even know what art journaling was at that point. I was just like, well, this looks fun and I got time. And so I went, and yeah, that's when that started. And I've, done a lot. I did a lot of analog collage for a long time. Really enjoyed it. I still have a studio filled with lots of analog collage supplies that really need tending to. But I did start the digital work at about the time Bob got sick. So it was a really interesting new art process, right? Because I knew what I wanted to do, but I didn't know how to make the computer do it. And so I had to it was a lot of head and heart, instead of sometimes when you're familiar with the medium, you're just going with your heart, and the rest is all working muscle memory kind of thing. But that was not the case with the journal, with the Hospice Doctor's Widow, because I was teaching myself this digital collage all the way through it. Yeah. But that's, it's a great way to keep all parts of you occupied, kind of focused on something.
I'm looking here, and if anybody has a question, feel free, down in the more or reactions, there's the Zoom hand raising icon. Feel free to use that to raise your hand. I can't actually see you if you just go like this, because there's too many of you on the call, which is a good process to have. And if you have any questions or anything that you'd like to share, like if you've had a similar experience in terms of using art as a way to process grief or loss. And yes, Ken, do you want to just say what you just said? What you just wrote in the chat?
I think you should.
You think I should say what you just
Yes.
wrote in the chat? Okay, then.
You're such a fine speaker, Susan.
Well, we're going to go to Reverend Becky Drake right now, and I will come back to yours as soon as I can find it in the chat again. Just scroll past it.
Thank you,
Becky,
Susan,
do you want to?
Jenna.
Yeah, go ahead and
Yes,
unmute
thank you,
yourself.
Susan.
Thank you.
Jennifer, thank you very much for that presentation. And you hit a lot of memory nerves with me, because I didn't do what you did with the collages, but I wrote poetry immediately the morning after. And it ended up being 365 poems on grief and loss, but also on sexual bereavement, because I missed him next to me. And I was in the same situation where he had 2 weeks in, a semi-induced coma. And at the end, when we brought him out, because we knew that in the situation room, there was no hope for him to survive what was happening to his body. He had COPD and advanced heart disease, which are, side by side, the progressive. So we had the time to talk as well and do advanced preparation. But you spoke about anticipatory grief. And so 9 years later, I still grieve him. I miss him desperately, even though my life has changed dramatically and I've become a very, engaged, independent person. I'm working on my Doctor of Ministry on trauma and grief and loss because of this. And I really love to help people. So how did you feel physically, and how did you connect your brain and your body together after all of this? Because I think that for me, it was hard for me to understand what was happening in my body. I had strange feelings. I couldn't sleep. I lost a tremendous amount of weight. So I had a lot of physical things happen. And I was wondering if you had that any manifestations that were very different from who you truly are as a person after all of that time of caregiving.
Yeah, I definitely experienced it physically. I I really could only stomach, so embarrassing, Eggo waffles. That was like if I wanted something in my stomach, the only thing that I could sort of eat and keep down was Eggo waffles. So I did that for a while. I remember as prepared as I felt we were, I was just crushed, absolutely crushed. And I just wanted him back. Like every time I would finally sort of stop, I move a lot. That helps me kind of keeping moving, whether it's walking or doing art or whatever, or laundry for that matter, right? Keeping myself busy was very helpful, but of course you can't do that 24/7. And so the minute I would sit down, I just kept thinking, just come back, just please come back. I mean, I didn't want any of the illness and the suffering. I wanted my Bob back. And I still do. I mean, it's not as acute as it was certainly. But I still miss him. It'll be 8 years in January, and I still miss him a lot. And I can totally relate to, there's other journal entries about the physical, just kind of, touching him, when we would spend time together when he was sick. He really liked me to rub on his head, and I'd do it, but I'd often have to like read or do something else because it was just so emotional knowing that I was taking the feel of his skin in as much as I could, knowing I wouldn't be able to reproduce it. I can hear him talking to me, right? Like, especially, whatever, when I do something stupid or whatever, sometimes just even being silly, I can hear him. And
I'm with you there.
he definitely makes his presence known. But I knew I would not be able to smell him, and I would not be able, I'd need to remember the touch, the feeling of his skin. And that was really hard for a long time afterward. And this is also in the journal. I would just lean into his closet and take a big, deep breath. And of course, after a while, they just smell like clothes. But that helps. That helps a lot. Yeah. Yeah. No, I definitely, I mean, that's the thing you can't, right? You can't reproduce that in any real way.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
moment.
Thank you so much for the question too.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. Any other questions?
I'm going to just read there. I'm going to go scroll down, but what Ken put up here, because I think it just really talks to this conversation possibly that you just had, is art offers a profound outlet for emotions, allowing individuals to process their grief in unique and transformative ways. For many, creating art can be seen as a bridge between sorrow and healing, fostering connection and understanding in moments of profound loss. And yes to that. There are some other comments here. Let me scroll down to here. Elisabeth says, out of grief comes art. That's my motto. Marjorie, I'm going to send links. There's a question about how to download the site. Somebody's looking at this from their phone. So what's going to happen after this is Ken, when he has a moment, is going to put this up on the Elisabeth Kübler-Ross YouTube channel where it will be available, and I will be able to send everybody that attended today an email with Jennifer's resources about the books, her website, and so you don't need to worry about trying to look at it on your phone today. I will send that to you.
And if you do download any of those resources, then you'll be on my, as I told you, on my email list, and then I'll send an email as soon as I know the dates
Mhm.
of the reissue of Hospice Doctor's Widow and the new book. Who knows? At this point, they may come out in the same day. We just don't
Would be
know.
great.
It's a mystery.
Mary Hughes commented that she's an end-of-life doula and she wants to share that she's been obsessed lately with the film Living with Ghosts. Not
Yeah,
familiar.
I've heard of that film. I'm gonna have to check that out. I'm eager to check that out. I live with a bunch of them. I mean, I've lost my whole family, right? Like,
Yes.
bear with me, man.
Yeah. Yeah, when you were saying that you still hear Bob's voice, I was thinking my teacher, Stephen Levine, would always tell people in any of the workshops we did that he would recommend that no matter how long somebody's been dead, that there's never too late to have a conversation with them. And that has been sort of my experience. My Bob died almost 33 years ago. And I still hear him all the time, often when I do something ridiculous, but whenever like things just happen and people are like, well, how did that happen? And I just will say like, and very honestly, but they think I'm being facetious. Like I have a lot of dead friends and I told them while they were dying, if I'm taking care of them while they're dying, they're going to take care of me while I'm still living. And I
Right.
feel like that has happened for the last 30 years. All kinds of stuff happens. And I'm just like, I have a lot of dead friends that I think are really taking care of things. So this idea of having conversations or saying the thing that you never got to say, or that after they died, you're like, oh my God, I didn't say this. I wish I did. Find a quiet spot. And sometimes they'll even answer you, is what I found. You're
I
shaking your
think you're
head,
right.
Jennifer. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes. Yeah.
definitely.
And
Bob
Elizabeth,
comes to me in electronics and dogs. Like
dogs.
dogs will come up to me and like have like smile on their face. And, and I'm not real, I mean, I don't dislike dogs, but I'm not a pet person in general. So like they'll just come at me and anyway.
Yeah. Bob, my friend, would leave these little red surround. They were little red like hearts. That I would find everywhere, these little tiny parts that were like glitter kind of things that you throw out of a bag or something. And
Oh,
it was like
wow.
really, I would find them whenever I was in the most despair. I would literally just look down and there'd be one on the floor and everything else, there'd be nothing. Like, I'm like, what the hell? But I realized the last gift he gave, he was a caterer and we were doing a Valentine's Day party. I think it was at Diane Feinstein, like some Nancy Pelosi. He had very big clients in San Francisco, and he gave us all these little red ceramic hearts to wear. And so when he died, I had the ceramic heart in the palm of my hand, which was over his heart. And we had this sort of extraordinary energy exchange. And then for years and years, I would find them. I tried to collect them, and there were so many of them, I just stopped. So these little signs, who knows what they are? I think it's great to have an idea that is sustaining and loving and caring. And they could be nothing, but like, why not go with what feels right?
I
I'm
think
curious if, yeah,
Michelle
Michelle has her
Lasoda
hand
has a
up.
question.
Yeah, Michelle, if you want to unmute, please. Thank you.
Hey, first of all, Jen is fabulous. I'm so happy to be here. That was such an incredible, conversation. And I pulled as many coworkers into that as I could. That's where we were coming and going. But this recent conversation made me think, I hope it makes you laugh. My father passed away in 2004 suddenly and unexpectedly. And sometime after that, a few years, grief changes in all different ways. But I remember the Powerball was really high and I bought a lottery ticket. And I remember thinking like, all right, Dad, just like any help you can give would be really great. Like doesn't have to be the whole thing, but like just enough to make life a little bit easier. And I swear I could hear him go, Jesus Christ, even after you're dead, they're still asking you for money. Kids really never stop asking you for money. It's true. And it just made me chuckle. I didn't even think of this.
Right. Thank you, Michelle. And thank you for coming. It means a lot to me. Michelle is the nurse with the purple hair. If you all are familiar with that documentary, which is beautiful. Thanks so much.
You. And Elizabeth, also, I will include this as a resource, Elizabeth, the grief dialogues, where people can share their stories, poetry, and other visual art forms on the website. So I will include that as one of the resources for this.
Thank you,
And
Susan. I just
Yeah.
want to add one thing about Jennifer's book,
Please.
because I have written about artists who have channeled their grief into professional art, or they were professional artists and they used their grief to even expand their art. But the beauty to me of Jennifer's book was the collage aspect, the aspect that anybody, don't have to have artistic talent, although you do have to have an artistic eye in some ways, like Jennifer does. But you don't even have that to be able to create a collage that means something to you. And to me, that's what the beauty of the book is, the beauty in its simplicity. So thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much. And Ken is also putting up another interesting resource, is The Secret World of Drawings by Greg Firth. It discusses interpreting drawings of those who are grieving. That's another excellent resource. Curious if anybody else would like to raise their hand or has a question that they'd like to ask or an experience they'd like to share. We still have a couple of minutes left. Lee, please go ahead.
Hi there. Thanks so much. This was just wonderful. My question is more nuts and bolts. Is there a particular application or a resource of images that are in the public domain that you use to create your artworks?
That's a great question. Yes, I probably drew on Pixabay, more pixabay.com more than anything. I've learned some other places, but like I don't mean to be evasive about that. What I've learned is how I go on. I like a lot. As you saw in the book is, other than those new collages, the book is several years old now, and that first slide of all the different collages is probably more indicative of the work I'm doing now. And one of the things I've figured out is I go on Etsy and I put in, Victorian flowers or, whatever, cutouts or Christmas or something like that, digital download. I always put the term digital download in. And you do have to be careful because not everything on Etsy, right? But there are a lot of folks are taking stuff that's totally royalty free and making PNGs out of them that just make it easier for someone like you and me to just download them. And they're not expensive. They're not free, but they're not expensive. Pixabay is free. But that's another thing I have learned. I'm just very careful about not using stuff that's not royalty free.
Thank you. I've been scanning things in, like for someone who's passed, scanning the cards that they received in and taking the words from them because they're meaningful to that person and their loved ones provided them. But this idea of before the loss is a wonderful one.
Yeah. No, scanning is, on the Precious Time page, the little girl that you see there, that's my grandmother. So I just scanned an old picture of my grandmother. I have family on this call, so I will also admit that the photo that seems like it's supposed to be of Bob's parents is actually my grandparents. I just didn't have a great photo. I had a great photo of them, but it was from way back and it wasn't reflective of what the important message of that journal entry. So I used a little artistic license and used a photo of my own grandparents. The insiders all knew that when I put that one up.
Thank you.
Ira, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question? Shira? Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Jennifer. Let me begin by saying I so honor you for sharing your life, your family, your husband, and being able to express the mistakes that you made. The wonderful thing about it is how we learn from that. You learn so much from those that are leaving this earth. I just want to say that I worked with Elisabeth for 12 years, and I was in a hospital, and I worked in hospice also. And again, Ken, I'm moving to Arizona next month, so I'll be able to spend more time with you. I'd like to do that. I worked with kids, and one step that I just wanted to say about hospice is that we are forgetting sometimes bringing the kids into what's going on. Parents often seem to think that maybe it's too harsh or it's too difficult. And it's not that way. They learn, maybe they may see things happening and they don't understand what's going on. And yet, as adults, it's so easy to sit and talk with them about what's going on. Sometimes kids have to come up and say to you several times, "Can you tell me the same thing that you said last week?" And it's not that they're forgetting on purpose, it's just that they have a small brain and they're learning new things. And so they are learning. And we don't want to keep kids out of the family, whether it's cousins or specifically if it's children, male and female, whatever it is. So for you to know that in terms of hospices, those of you that are looking for it, hospices are now going into teen kids. I was in there for quite a while there too, and it's really wonderful having the kids involved with what's going on too. So I just wanted to say that I really love what you said. I love the work that you've done. I'm looking forward to the other books that you're having, and maybe I'll see all of you pretty soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Michelle, you have your hand up again. Would you like to go ahead?
I just wanted to piggyback on that, which I think was such a beautiful point to bring up. And just from my experience in doing hospice work for many years, and even in my own personal loss with my kids, I think one of the things that I have learned is that what makes things scary for kids is when they see the adults that they depend on, sort of rattled and frazzled and sad, and they don't know why. And that because we're the rock. So it's not often that kids see mom and dad crying, and to not explain that is what makes it scary. And I've learned that to allow them to ask questions and, tell them that there are things that they can touch that won't cause harm, like oxygen tubing and, suction and things like that, just so they have these little inquisitive minds, and to bring it down to a level that makes sense for kids. When my father-in-law was dying, my son was 6, and, I let him come in and ask questions and explain to him that, cancer has a specific name for a reason. And I also didn't want him to think, I didn't want to say the term sick, because I didn't want him to think that every time somebody got sick, they were going to die. And so we talked about the difference between being sick and having a sickness or an illness with a specific name and why it has that name. And there was a differentiation there. And then as, my father-in-law was dying, I sort of said to him, Pop's heart is like a battery. And, we're unable to replace the battery when it stops working. And when that happens, his arms and legs will not move, and he will no longer be able to talk. And we sort of took it like that, and it sort of made sense in kid terms. And we approached the funeral that way, and I allowed him to make the decision of whether or not he wanted to go and see Pop, knowing his battery doesn't work anymore and his arms and legs won't move, and that we all get dressed up, because we want to, celebrate his life and say goodbye. And then sort of fast forward, because he did very good with that. And anytime he got sad afterwards, I stopped what I was doing and acknowledged his grief. And then we would pull out a photo album and we would look at pictures to be able to go through that and acknowledge this is a very important moment. And this is someone we love that we missed. And we would, send balloons, when there was important occasions. So we would send messages, things like that. But moving forward, we later had a suicide in the family, and there were other children that had to attend a funeral. And, we now had to explain the difference between suicide and illness. And I watched my son help the other children in the family go like, oh, I understand, we're going to get dressed up. The battery hasn't worked. But in that time, we didn't say it stopped working. We said the battery broke, and he was able to communicate that to the other children. And it was really, it was beautiful to watch in that grieving moment how they were able to connect and make it less scary for each other and make it make sense. And, you know, there's a process to it for a reason. So I think that was a beautiful, beautiful point to bring up.
Absolutely. I think also the thing to, I of course don't have children and have very little experience with children in the grief space or children in any space for that matter, but I was fairly young when my brother died, and I would say that the sitting down and looking at photos, you know, that isn't going to work for every adult. You have to find the adult in your circle who can do that with the kids. And it may not be their mom and dad, right? Because that just may be too hard because you know, people process it differently. I love looking at pictures now, but in the years after my brother died, I didn't want, you know, I didn't want reminders. I didn't need them. So that's a great thing to do with kids, and just figure out who's the best person to do that. Or even who's the best person in a particular moment to do it.
Mhm.
Totally.
Yeah. I want to just
Thanks,
say,
Michelle.
oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm just
Oh.
saying thank you.
With kids, I was just writing about this last night about my first experience with death. My grandmother, who was, I was her oldest grandchild, or I thought until I was almost 62 that I was her oldest grandchild. And I remember her death, and it was so traumatic in our family. It was the first time I saw my mother being very emotive, and it was so scary. My brother and I jumped up from the breakfast table and hid under the kitchen table just to like observe it, thinking we were. And then being, yeah, like my father coming down and like telling us we had to go back and finish breakfast to go to school, and being like so sure. I was like, what's the matter? Like I could see with my eyes, like I was 7, I think, that something is dreadfully the matter here. My mother is sobbing over the kitchen counter. And I'll never forget my parents both turning around to me and saying, everything is fine. You have to go to school. Everything's fine. And when I was writing about it last night, this happened 60 years ago, you know, it's just becoming so clear. Like that was the very first time in my life that my feelings were discredited. So I did not trust my own feelings for a long time. I thought, well, they're my parents, so everything must be fine, and I must be misinterpreting what I'm seeing. And I've said over the years to parents, like when working in hospice, and I used to facilitate a young adults support group, and also like sort of help with a children's group. Of all of them were life threatened and all of them died. And the kids just saying it's just so great that we have a place where we can just talk about what's really happening, because at home, if I talk about I'm going to die from this brain tumor, my mother starts crying and I know I have to stop. And I think with kids and death, giving them as much space around the concept as possible and letting them choose what they feel is appropriate for them. But I think you know, I think for my parents looking back on it, they were, you know, this was new to them. They'd never had a death in their family that I knew about. But their thought, I think, was that everything's fine and kids should be protected from what's really happening. And I remember for years in hospice, I would say to people like, if you want to know what's happening in your family, ask your children, because they know everything that's happening in your family. So trying to protect themselves to protect them from something that they can clearly see is happening by disregarding their feelings about it, that is not useful. Like if they're asking what's the matter, to be as clear as possible, like why you're crying, like why this is sad. That is an important thing for them to understand in terms of regulating their own feelings around difficult emotions. And you know, I think I was
Right.
just part of that 60s, 50s, and 60s child rearing where everything is always fine. We're all great.
Yeah.
That's what's happening. We're all good. So yeah. Anybody else that would like to say something? I'm looking, we have lots of so many thank yous, Jennifer, and how beautiful this has been, and inspirational that this has been. And if anybody else has anything they'd like to say just before we go, I'm going to stay on for about 5 minutes after this is over. There are times where people are too shy to ask a question while we're being recorded, so I'll let you know when the recording is ended. And if you'd like to stay, please feel free to do that. I think Jennifer is also available for about 5 minutes after this is over. So on behalf of the Elisabeth Kübler-Ross Foundation, I just want to thank you so much, Jennifer. This really was a beautiful, beautiful presentation, just visually, but also, you know, this idea that grief is so overwhelming in so many cases, and there's a way that we can keep pace with it. And like if art or creativity, whatever somebody's sort of means is, or medium is, that can be such a useful way to also commemorate the legacy that of the person of your beloved. I'm going to also thank those of you that are attending that were able to make a donation. And I know that's not possible for everybody. That really does keep this foundation going. There are no grants. There's no other way that we keep the foundation going. And I want to thank Ken for being here today and doing such a beautiful job of continuing your mother's legacy in this way. So thank you all. I'm going to turn off the recording right now, and you'll get a message that that's happened. And then we can go ahead and just have a little casual conversation. Thank you all for being here.